Hello everyone and welcome to Chess5. Today I am going to show you the game between Caruana Fabiano versus Anish Giri. And this game is from the Fide Candidates tournament which was played in 2021 on 23rd April. And this is the round number 12. So Caruana Fabiano with the white pieces and Anish Giri with the black pieces. This is going to be a very interesting game as it's a classical game which was played on the board. So it's going to be a very epic game because both players are very strong. So let's see who will win the game. So Caruana Fabiano with the white pieces started with 1 e4 and Anish Giri with the black pieces replied with c5, the Sicilian defense. Knight to f3, e6, here d4, c into d4, knight into d4. All those who doesn't know, I'll tell you, the main idea of playing Sicilian defense is the only motive of black is to open up the position by playing d5. So the plan of black is to play d5 anyhow, and the plan of white is to develop the pieces and to somehow stop black's d5. So I think this is going to help you. This point is going to help you very much. So after knight into d4, Anish played knight to f6, hitting the pawn on e4. So knight to c3, protecting the pawn on e4. Knight to c6. Here a3, stopping bishop to b4 because this pin becomes very annoying as this knight is also attacking the e4 pawn. So a3, here bishop to e7, preparing to castle. Bishop to e3, simply developing the pieces. Castle, bishop to e2, here d6. So black is having a very fine structure. Everything is protected and very solid position for black. So queen to d3, here bishop to d7, here f4. Here we can clearly see that Caruana Fabiano wants to attack on the black king. That's why he played f4. Perhaps the idea could be to play even h4, h5, g4, g5, or to play e5, or perhaps to do long castle and put another rook to g1 and going to attack with g4. There are many ideas for white in this position. So black played e5, opening up the position. So here knight into c6. Here white was having many options, like white can take the pawn, white can move the knight to somewhere else like to f3, or he can take the knight. So I decided to grab the knight. Here b into c3, b into c6. Here castle. Here e into f4, because now white's threat is to play f5, and once white executed the move f5, then he's going to push g4 g5, and it's going to be a very deadly attack. So black decided to capture the f4 pawn. Here bishop into f4, and we can see this e4 pawn is a bit weakness because it's an isolated pawn. So here bishop into f4. Here the threat is to capture the d6 pawn. So bishop to e6, protecting the pawn with the queen as well as the bishop. Here queen to g3, perhaps planning to play bishop h6 as pawn cannot take the bishop because the g7 pawn is hanging. So here knight to d7, rook to d1, putting some pressure on this file. Here rook to e8, king to h1. Here many of you were thinking like, why white is not capturing the pawn on d6y. Let's see what will happen if white captures the pawn on d6. If white captures the pawn on d6 with the bishops, which is obviously very natural, then comes queen to b6 check, king to h1, here bishop into d6, here rook into d6, and here queen into b2. So that's the point. Here white played king h1 because now white can capture the pawn on d6. Before that, black is threatening queen b6 check and preparing to capture the b2 pawn. That's why white cannot capture, the d6 pawn. That's why Caruana played king to h1. Now he's preparing to capture the d6 pawn. So here Anish played queen to b8, protecting the d6 pawn and also attacking the b2 pawn. So Caruana played b4. Here knight to e5 and here b5. They are just creating some weaknesses, like if pawn takes, then bishop takes. If pawn push, then if black pushes the pawn to c5, then the d5 pawn is weak. The d5 square is very weak, as well as the d6 pawn is also very weak. So here Anish played rook to c8, saying okay, you can capture my pawn. I am going to capture the pawn with the rook and going to pressure up like the knight as well as the pawn. So here Caruana played still b into c6. Here rook into c6, putting some pressure on the knight as well as the pawn. So here knight comes to d5, planning to capture the bishop on e7 and also poking the king as well as the rook. So Anish played queen to f8, protecting the bishop on e7. Here c3, he protecting the pawn with the knight as well as the queen. So Anish played rook to c8, putting more pressure on the c3 pawn. So comes rook to c1, knight to g6, because there could be some threats with bishop to g6. So here comes bishop to d2 back, protecting the c3 pawn. Here bishop to h4, attacking the queen on g3, queen e3, rook to c5, here c4, here h6, here queen to b3, taking up the open fight, bishop to g5, saying okay, let's trade the bishops, because white threat is to play bishop to b4 and perhaps to play c5 in the future. So black plays bishop to g5, because now white cannot move his bishop because the rook is hanging on c1. So here Caruana played bishop into g5, h into g5 and queen to g3, and now we can see that the pawn on g5 is like it's a bit weak. So Anish played queen to d8, protecting the g5 pawn somehow. Here rook to d1, putting some pressure on the d6 pawn. Here bishop into d5, e into d5 and knight to f4. And we can see the knight on f4 is like looks a very powerful piece, as it attacks the bishop on e2, and it also like on the king side now. It's the knight on f4 is on the king side, so it looks a bit dangerous. So after knight to f4, white played queen to f2, saying okay, you can capture my bishop, perhaps I will capture your f7 pawn and going to take a draw. So here Anish played rook to c7, first protecting the f7 pawn and perhaps then capturing the bishop on e2, because after queen into e2 the pawn is hanging on c4. So white played rook to d4, protecting the pawn on c4. Here comes queen to e8, queen as well as the knight is attacking the bishop on e2. So bishop goes to f3. Here rook into c4, rook into c4 and rook into c4, and we can see that black is a pawn plus. So but now comes queen into a7 and white is having a passed pawn, but it is very hard to promote this pawn as it's an isolated pawn and it's very weak. And here black played rook to a4, attacking the queen as well as the pawn. So here in this position Caruana played queen to f2, which was a blunder, and it gives a winning position for black. In this position he should have played queen to c7, because the idea is, I am going to show you in the game, queen f2 was played. So rook into a3, here h4, here queen to e5, and here comes h into g5, queen into g5, and it's winning position because king is like, the white pieces can't do anything. And if we go to the same line, which was queen, at the place of playing queen to f2, he should have played queen to c7. And if we see the same move which was played in the game, like rook into a3, here all those who are thinking queen into d6, this was a blunder, because now comes a very powerful move, rook into f3. If rook into f3, then queen e1 check, rook f1, rook queen into f1, and it's a checkmate. So after rook into f3, if you capture the rook with the pawn on g2, then comes queen to e2. Now threat is to capture the rook on f1 and do a checkmate, and also the threat is to put the queen on g2 with the help of knight and going to checkmate on g2. So white plays here queen b8 check, king h7, queen b1 check, g6, and it looks like white have defended, but white cannot do anything about this g2 checkmate, because if he tries to do something like rook g1, then simply comes queen into f3 check, rook g2, and queen into g2 checkmate. He cannot stop the checkmate. That's why it's not possible. So after rook into a3, white should have played h4, and here if queen e5, then the main idea of playing queen to c7 at the place of queen to f2 was, because now comes a very powerful move, queen to d8 check, and after king goes to h7, white can capture the g5 pawn with the queen, and it's a drawish position. So it would be very helpful for Caruana, because after queen into g5, h into g5, it's a drawish position. White is having 3 pawns, black is having 3 pawns. White is having bishop and rook, and black is having knight and rook, so it's a draw end game. But queen f2 was played, which was a blunder. Here Anish played rook into a3, h4, queen to e5, h into g5, queen into g5, and here's your moment. Feel free to pause the video, and we can see black have to somehow make this rook work as his own piece. So you have to do something to checkmate the white king. So how will you join the rook in the party to checkmate the white king? Okay, so all those who have found the right way to activate the rook, congratulations, you are very good at imagination, because now comes a very powerful move. Okay, the idea of black is to play f5 or even f6, king f7, rook a8, and rook h8. Just think, if the rook on a3 will be on h8, then how powerful the rook would have been. So that's the point which we are going to see in the game. After queen into g5, white played rook to e1. Here rook comes back to a8. Now the plan is to play f5, king f7, and rook a8 check. So white plays bishop to e4. Here first rook a2, saying attacking the queen. If white in the game, white played rook b1. All those who are thinking like this is a free piece, why not capture the piece? Because it's a losing, because now comes queen h4 check, king g1, queen into e2, queen into e1 check, king to h2, and queen into e4. And black is just a piece plus with 2 pawns extra, so it's a winning game for black. That's why here rook b1 was played. Here rook goes back to a8. Here rook to e1, and here f5, attacking the bishop and also making a square for the king to come on f7. So bishop goes to b1, king to f7, and this is a very powerful move sorry, and it's a very powerful move coming on the rook coming on h8. Very powerful move. So in the game, rook e3 was played, rook to h8 check, king to g1, and here knight into g2. The idea is the queen cannot capture the knight because the rook is hanging on e3 and it's game over for white. And white can't actually do anything after knight into g2. Black is just going to move his rook knight and going to give a checkmate on h1. So it's game over for white. So this was an awesome game by both the players, Caruana Fabiano versus Anish Giri. Here, if you like this game, then please like this video, and if you are new to my channel, then please subscribe the channel so that you will be getting notification whenever I will upload a new video. Thank you for watching, and bye bye.